The Vorthari were known across the galaxy as the oldest and most powerful civilization. Their empire had stood for over 100,000 years, their rulers untouched by time, their warriors undefeated in battle. They claimed immortality, a gift of their superior evolution. To them, other species were nothing more than fleeting sparks, living brief and insignificant lives before vanishing into oblivion. And humanity, they were barely worth noticing. When the Vorthari declared their latest challenge to the galaxy, it was not the first time. They often invited other species to test their strength, to prove them wrong, to show that death could touch them. No one ever succeeded. Civilizations had tried, armies had marched, and entire fleets had been crushed under the weight of Vorthari supremacy. They watched lesser species struggle, amused by their foolishness, knowing the outcome was always the same. This time, however, something different happened. When the challenge was broadcast across the stars, humanity responded. But they did not send an armada. They did not send their greatest warriors, nor their most advanced weapons. They sent a single man, a lone human. No armor, no weapons, no fleet to back him. Just himself. His name was Dr. Adrian Kale. He was not a soldier. He was not a warrior. He was a scientist. And when he stepped onto the cold, metallic surface of the Vorthari capital world, billions of eyes across the galaxy watched in stunned silence. The Vorthari laughed at the absurdity of it. A mere human, alone, standing in the heart of their empire. The Grand Hall of Eternity was a place of legends. The towering walls shimmered with golden inscriptions, each one marking the death of a species that had dared to challenge the Vorthari. There was no mark for humanity. Not yet. Adrian stood at the center of the hall, facing the High Lord Vorkath, the ruler of the Vorthari Empire. The alien's silver eyes gleamed with amusement as he studied the human before him. He was tall, his body covered in armor made of living metal. His voice echoed through the chamber, carrying centuries of arrogance. "You are alone," Vorkath said, his lips curling in a smirk. "Your people send a single man to face eternity. What is this, a joke?" Adrian did not flinch. He did not bow, did not tremble, did not show the fear that so many before him had. He simply met Vorkath's gaze, his own eyes calm, unreadable. "You call yourselves immortal," Adrian said, his voice steady. "I came to see if that was true." Laughter erupted from the Vorthari gathered in the hall. The sound echoed through the vast chamber, filled with mockery and scorn. A human questioning their immortality. It was ridiculous. Vorkath leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "And how, little human, do you plan to test us?" Adrian took a single step closer. The guards tensed, their hands resting on weapons that had slaughtered countless challengers before him. But he showed no fear. "Let me show you," Adrian said. The High Lord studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Very well, human. We shall entertain this foolishness. But know this, when you fail, your name will be forgotten, just like all the others who thought they could defy us." Adrian smiled. "We'll see." The first test was pain. A trial by fire, one that had broken warriors made of steel, shattered creatures with exoskeletons harder than diamonds. Adrian was strapped to a device designed to inflict agony beyond imagination. The Vorthari watched, waiting for him to scream, to beg for mercy, to collapse like every other challenger had before him. But he did not. The flames licked his skin. The pain seared through his nerves, but he did not cry out. He did not surrender. He endured, his breath steady, his eyes locked on Vorkath's. The High Lord frowned. The second test was death. The Vorthari had long mastered the art of execution. They had ways to strip the soul from the body, to erase a being from existence so thoroughly that even their own people would forget them. Adrian stood in the center of the chamber as the executioner approached, a blade made of void metal in his hands. A single touch would end him. The blade came down. And then it stopped. Adrian was still standing, The executioner stumbled back, his hands trembling. The void metal, which had erased entire bloodlines, had done nothing to the human. A murmur of confusion spread through the hall. Vorkat's amusement faded. He stepped forward, staring at Adrian with new eyes. "What are you?" he demanded. Adrian tilted his head. "A man." The High Lord's fingers clenched into fists. "No, there is something more to you." Adrian's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. Perhaps. For the first time in 1,000 years, uncertainty flickered in the eyes of the Vorthari ruler. He had seen many things in his long life, but never this. Never a human who did not break. The hall, once filled with laughter, was now filled with silence. The galaxy watched, waiting. The test had only just begun. The Vorthari were an ancient race, their empire stretching across thousands of worlds. They ruled with absolute certainty, believing themselves to be immortal. For centuries, no species had challenged their claim. They did not age as other beings did. Their bodies healed from any wound. Their minds remained sharp even after thousands of years. They saw death as a weakness, something lesser creatures like humans had to suffer. The challenge was issued from the Vorthari High Council, broadcast across the galaxy. "Prove to us that your kind is not bound by the chains of mortality. Step forward, if you dare." The words were arrogant, filled with the certainty that no species could match them. Many civilizations watched but remained silent. No one wanted to draw the attention of the Vorthari. No one, except humanity. When the response came, it shocked the galaxy. Humanity did not send an army, nor a team of scientists. They did not send a delegation of their best minds. They sent a single man. His name was Dr. Adrian Kale. He was not a soldier. He was not a leader. He was a scientist, a man of quiet thought and careful observation. And yet, he walked alone onto the Vorthari homeworld, his expression calm as he faced an empire that had never known fear. The Vorthari gathered in their great council hall, a massive structure carved from black stone that had stood for millennia. The tallest of them, a being known as Lord Vasher, stepped forward. His golden eyes shimmered with amusement as he looked at Adrian. "This is what humanity offers," he said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "One man, a fragile being, destined to wither and die like the rest of your kind." Adrian did not react to the insult. He simply stood there, hands resting in the pockets of his long coat, his expression unreadable. "You wanted a challenger," he said. His voice was steady, almost too calm for someone standing before a race that could crush him with a thought. "I am here." Murmurs spread through the Vorthari Council. They had expected a warrior, perhaps one of humanity's cybernetic soldiers or enhanced beings. But this man was ordinary. No armor, no weapons, no sign of augmentation. Just a simple human with clear eyes and a steady heart. Lord Vasher laughed. "Very well, human. You will be tested, and when you fail, your species will know its place." Adrian gave him a small smile, one that did not reach his eyes. "Let's begin." The first test was pain. The Vorthari prided themselves on their ability to withstand any injury. Their bodies healed instantly, their nerves dull to suffering. A blade was drawn, its edge humming with energy. Without hesitation, one of the Vorthari warriors slashed it across Adrian's arm. The crowd leaned forward, expecting him to cry out, to show weakness. Adrian did not flinch. Blood welled from the wound, dark against his pale skin. He looked down at it, then back at the warrior. "Is that all?" he asked. The warrior frowned. Human bodies should react differently. They should scream, recoil, show signs of distress. But Adrian simply stood there, his breathing steady. The wound did not heal instantly, as a Vorthari's would, but his lack of reaction unsettled them. Lord Vasher narrowed his eyes. "Increase the pain." Electric shocks followed, burning heat against his skin, even poison introduced into his veins. Each time, Adrian endured it in silence. His body suffered, But his will did not break. The Vortheri did not understand. Pain was meant to control, to dominate. Yet this human faced it with indifference. Finally, Lord Vasher stepped forward, studying him closely. "What are you?" he demanded. "No human can endure this without breaking." Adrian met his gaze, and for the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Something dangerous. "You think pain is what makes us weak?" he asked softly. "You think death is something to fear?" He took a step forward, and the Vorthari warriors tensed. "That is where you are wrong." The chamber grew silent. For the first time in centuries, the Vorthari felt something they had forgotten. Not fear, not yet, but uncertainty. This man was not what they expected, and they had no idea what would come next. The silence in the great hall of the Vorthari stretched, heavy and oppressive. The immortal beings who ruled the galaxy stood motionless, their golden eyes studying the human before them. Adrian Kale remained still, his expression unreadable despite the wounds on his body. Blood dripped from his arm, his skin burned from their tests, but his posture never wavered. He should have been in agony. He should have been broken. Yet he stood there, breathing evenly, his gaze steady. Lord Vasher took a slow step closer, his towering form casting a shadow over Adrian. "You believe you have proven something, human," he said, his voice a mix of amusement and irritation. "Enduring pain does not make you immortal." Adrian tilted his head slightly, considering the words. "And yet it was your first test," he replied. "If pain is meaningless, why use it?" The question sent a ripple of discomfort through the Vorthari Council. No species had ever spoken to them this way, not without fear. Adrian was different. He did not fight back, did not threaten them. He simply endured, and somehow that was more unsettling than any act of aggression. Lord Vasher's expression darkened. "Enough. We will move to the next trial." He turned to his warriors. "Take him to the chambers." Two Vorthari stepped forward, gripping Adrian's arms. He did not resist as they led him away, though his sharp eyes observed everything. The corridors of the Vorthari citadel were grand, lined with towering statues of their greatest leaders. Everything was built to remind others of their power, their dominance. To Adrian, it was a tomb, filled with beings who had lived too long, trapped in their own arrogance. They arrived at a chamber with walls of black stone. In the center stood a single chair, sleek and metallic, restraints ready to hold its occupant. Adrian was pushed forward. "Sit," one of the warriors commanded. Adrian raised an eyebrow, but complied, lowering himself into the chair. The restraints locked around his wrists and ankles. He did not struggle. A new figure entered the room, draped in robes that shimmered with energy. The markings on his forehead indicated his status, one of the Vorthari's greatest scholars, a master of knowledge that spanned centuries. He studied Adrian with clinical interest. "You do not possess enhanced biology," the scholar said. "Your body is fragile. Your cells decay like all mortals. And yet, you are different." He reached out, a scanner in his hand. "Let us see what you are hiding." A wave of light passed over Adrian, scanning deep into his body, reading his vitals, his genetic code. The scholar's expression remained neutral at first, but as more data appeared, a frown formed on his face. He scanned again, and again. Something was wrong. Lord Vasher entered the chamber, impatience clear in his stance. "What have you found?" The scholar hesitated before speaking. "His body is ordinary. No enhancements, no genetic modifications. And yet, his cellular structure is." He trailed off, as if the words refused to come. Adrian smiled, the first genuine expression he had shown. "Go on," he said. The scholar's fingers tightened around the scanner. "His cells should be breaking down from the damage we inflicted. And yet they are repairing themselves. Not instantly, not like our own regeneration, but at a speed far beyond human norms." He looked at Adrian. "How is this possible?" Adrian did not answer immediately. He glanced at the restraints holding him, then back at the scholar. "You assume immortality is about never dying," he said. "But what if it is something else?" Lord Vasher's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Adrian leaned forward slightly. "You believe yourselves to be gods because time does not touch you. But immortality is not about living forever." He met their gaze. "It is about how you face death." A tense silence filled the chamber. The Vortheri had never feared death because they had never needed to. It was a concept that belonged to lesser beings. But now something in Adrian's words unsettled them. Lord Vasher stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "You are still mortal, human. You will die. And when you do, your kind will know its place." Adrian exhaled slowly. "Perhaps." His gaze sharpened. "But what if I am not the one who dies first?" The words lingered in the air like a storm on the horizon. For the first time in centuries, the Vortheri felt something they did not recognize. Doubt. "You said." The weight of Adrian's words settled over the room like a suffocating mist. The Vortheri, a species that had ruled for thousands of years without knowing fear, found themselves staring at a man who should have been powerless. Yet somehow, he had turned the tables on them. Lord Vasher studied Adrian, his golden eyes narrowing. "You speak in riddles, human, but riddles will not save you." His voice, once filled with amusement, now carried an edge of irritation. "Your body still bleeds. You still age. Whatever trick you are playing, it will not change what you are." Adrian tilted his head slightly, the faintest trace of a smirk appearing on his lips. "You assume I am playing a trick," he said. "But what if the truth is simply something you've never considered?" Lord Vasher exhaled sharply. "Enough." He turned to his warriors. "We will conduct a final test." His gaze flicked back to Adrian. "A duel." A murmur spread through the room. The Vortheri rarely fought in combat. They did not need to. Their immortality made war pointless. To challenge one of their own in a duel was an act of arrogance, even for a species as proud as they were. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "A duel?" Vasher smiled coldly. "You claim that we misunderstand mortality." He gestured toward the massive doors at the end of the hall. "Let us see if you truly understand what it means to fight for your life." The Vorthari warriors released Adrian from his restraints. His movements were slow as he stood, as if testing his body after the wounds they had inflicted. The blood had dried, but the pain had not faded. Yet, as he rolled his shoulders, he showed no sign of weakness. They led him into a grand arena, a circular coliseum bathed in artificial light. The stands were filled with hundreds of Vortheri, their expressions unreadable as they watched. At the center of the arena stood a single figure, one of the greatest warriors of their kind. Tall, broad-shouldered, his body wrapped in dark armor that shimmered with energy. His name was Valsur, a being who had lived for over 6,000 years. He had fought wars before the human race had even discovered fire. Adrian stepped forward, his boots pressing into the smooth floor of the arena. He carried no weapons, no armor. He simply stood there, looking up at the immortal warrior before him. Valsur studied him with mild curiosity. "A strange choice for a champion," he said, his voice like distant thunder. "You carry no blade, no shield." He tilted his head. "Do you even know how to fight?" Adrian exhaled, stretching his fingers. "I know enough." A deep chuckle rumbled from Valsur's chest. "Then let us see if you are as fearless as you pretend to be." Without warning, he moved. The Vortheri were not just immortal, they were powerful. Faster, stronger, beyond anything a human could match. Valsur closed the distance in an instant, his massive hand swinging toward Adrian's head. It should have been over in a single blow. But Adrian moved. Not like a warrior, not with the strength of a soldier, but with precision. His body twisted, sidestepping the attack by inches. Valsur's strike missed, not because Adrian was faster, but because he knew exactly where it would land. The crowd gasped. The warrior's golden eyes narrowed. "Luck," he muttered. Adrian didn't reply. Velsir attacked again, this time faster, his blows aiming to crush, to end the fight before it could begin. But Adrian was already moving before the strikes even landed. Every step, every motion, as if he had seen the fight play out before it even started. The Vortheri in the stands grew silent. Something was wrong. This was not how duels were supposed to go. Humans were supposed to be predictable, weak creatures bound by their short lives. And yet Adrian was dancing between the attacks, untouched. Velsir's frustration grew. With a growl, he launched forward, this time putting his full strength behind the attack. Adrian stepped into it. The moment of impact arrived, and Adrian moved in a way no one expected. He twisted, redirecting the force, using Velsir's momentum against him. The warrior stumbled. It was barely a misstep, just half a second of imbalance. But for the first time in 6,000 years, Velsir, a being who had never faltered, stumbled. The arena was silent. Adrian looked up at him, his breath steady. "Do you understand now?" he asked quietly. Velsir's expression shifted. Confusion. Uncertainty. For a being who had never tasted defeat, the feeling was alien. Lord Vasher rose from his seat, his golden eyes narrowing. "Enough," he declared. His voice echoed through the arena. "Kill him." Velsir hesitated, just for a moment. And that hesitation was all it took. Adrian struck. Not with strength, not with speed, but with timing. A single precise movement, his palm slamming into a point just below Velsir's ribs. A weak point, a place no one had ever dared to attack. The warrior froze. His breath hitched, his massive form trembled. Then slowly, he collapsed to his knees. A hushed murmur swept through the arena. The impossible had happened. A Vortheri, one of their strongest, was on his knees before a mortal. Adrian took a step back, watching as Velsir gasped, struggling for breath. He wasn't dead, not yet, but his body was failing him in a way it never had before. Lord Vasher's expression darkened. "What did you do?" Adrian exhaled, wiping blood from his lip. "You call yourselves immortal," he said softly, "but you've never faced death, never even considered it." His eyes locked onto Vasher's. "That's why you're weak." Velsir collapsed completely, his body unmoving. And for the first time in 1,000 years, a Vortheri had died. The silence in the arena was absolute. The Vortheri, a species that had never feared anything, now sat frozen in their seats. They had just witnessed something impossible. One of their strongest warriors, Velsir, lay motionless on the ground. His golden eyes, once filled with certainty, were now dull and lifeless. An immortal being had fallen. Adrian Kale stood over him, his breath slow and steady. He was injured, blood dripping from the cuts on his arms, but he didn't seem weakened. If anything, he looked calm, as if he had known this outcome from the very start. Lord Vasher's hands clenched into fists. His golden eyes blazed with fury, but beneath that rage was something new, something the Vortheri had never experienced. Doubt. He took a slow step forward, his voice a low growl. "What have you done?" Adrian tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You still don't understand." His gaze shifted toward Velsir's lifeless form. He was strong, but strength means nothing when you don't know your limits. The words struck deeper than any weapon could. The Vortheri were immortal. They had never needed to learn their limits, because there had never been a threat strong enough to force them to. They had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years without question. But now, for the first time in their existence, they realized they were not untouchable. A murmur spread through the arena. Whispers of confusion, of fear. "This is a deception," one of the elders hissed. "No mortal can kill an immortal." Lord Vasher's eyes flicked to his scholar, the one who had scanned Adrian earlier. "Explain this," he demanded. The scholar hesitated. His hands trembled as he checked his data. His body is still mortal. He does not regenerate like us. He does not have enhanced strength. He swallowed hard. But his cells, they react differently. Vasher's gaze darkened. How? The scholar's voice was barely above a whisper. They adapt. A ripple of unease swept through the room. Adrian smirked. You live so long that you believe time makes you invincible. His voice was calm, but there was something dangerous behind it now. But time does not make you strong. It makes you stagnant. Lord Vasher's hands tightened at his sides. You dare. Adrian took a step forward, interrupting him. I didn't kill him because I was stronger. He glanced down at Valzer's body. I killed him because he never had to fight for survival. He never had to learn what it means to truly struggle. Vasher's teeth clenched. We are the rulers of this galaxy. We err. Adrian's eyes burned into him. You were the rulers. Until now. The word sent shockwaves through the Vorthari. Their perfect world had just been shattered by a single human, a being they had mocked as weak and insignificant. Adrian turned his gaze to the crowd, addressing them now. You claim to be immortal, but have any of you actually been tested? Have you ever faced something that could truly destroy you? Silence. Adrian nodded. That's what I thought. Lord Vasher's face twisted in rage. Enough of this. He turned to his guards. Kill him. The warriors surrounding Adrian hesitated. Their hands were on their weapons, but none of them moved, because they had just watched an immortal fall. And for the first time in their existence, they wondered if they were next. Adrian exhaled slowly. You can try, he said, his voice unwavering. But if you strike me down, it won't change what happened here today. He took another step forward, his movements slow, deliberate. Your people will remember. They will question. And that fear you're feeling right now. His eyes locked onto Vasher's. It will only grow. Vasher roared in frustration, his pride refusing to accept this reality. I will not let a mortal defy us. His hand lifted, crackling with energy. He would end this human himself. But before he could strike, a voice rang out through the arena. Enough. Every head turned. An elder, one of the oldest Vorthari, stepped forward. His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. This human speaks the truth. Vasher's eyes widened. Elder Vertil, you cannot. The elder's voice was firm. For thousands of years, we have lived without challenge. We have believed ourselves untouchable. His gaze swept over the fallen warrior. But we were wrong. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some of the younger Vorthari looked at Adrian with something new in their eyes, not just confusion. Respect. Elder Vartil nodded toward Adrian. You have proven that we are not invincible, that we have weaknesses we have never faced. He exhaled slowly. And for that, you have earned the right to speak. Vasher's expression twisted with fury. You would let him live, after what he has done. Vartil's gaze remained steady. Would you rather live in ignorance, or would you rather face the truth? The tension in the arena was unbearable. And then, finally, Vasher lowered his hand. Adrian's smirk returned. Smart choice. The balance of power had shifted, and the Vorthari knew. Their age of unquestioned rule was over. The weight of the moment hung over the arena like a storm waiting to break. Adrian Kale stood tall, his body battered but his spirit unshaken. The Vorthari, the so-called immortal rulers of the galaxy, had just witnessed something unthinkable. One of their own had fallen to a mere mortal. Elder Vartil had spoken in Adrian's favor, recognizing the truth that most of the Vorthari were too afraid to admit. Their immortality had made them complacent. Their centuries of dominance had blinded them to the possibility that something stronger could exist. And now, they were faced with a decision. Lord Vasher, the highest-ranking warlord of the Vorthari, stood frozen. His rage was barely contained, his golden eyes burning with humiliation. You think this means anything? He spat. One death does not change the order of the galaxy. Adrian tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Doesn't it? The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Doubt. The first crack in the foundation of their empire. Elder Vartil turned to Vasher, his voice calm. If our rule was truly unshakable, you wouldn't need to silence him. You wouldn't need to kill him to make this moment disappear. Vasher's hands curled into fists. He was losing control. He could feel it. But then he smirked. A cold, calculating smirk. You misunderstand me, Elder, he said. I am not trying to silence him. His eyes locked onto Adrian. I am giving him what he wants. Adrian narrowed his eyes. And what exactly do you think I want? Vasher gestured toward the grand hall beyond the arena. You claim we are stagnant. You claim we are untested. His smile was razor sharp. Then let us test you. The murmurs stopped. Silence took its place. Vasher turned to the crowd, his voice booming. I declare a trial of dominion. Gasps echoed through the arena. Even Elder Vartil looked surprised. Adrian, however, simply raised an eyebrow. And that is? Vasher's smirk deepened. You say we are weak because we have never been tested. Very well. You will face our greatest champions. Not in a duel. No, that would be too simple. You will face them in a war. Adrian's eyes darkened. Vasher continued, relishing every word. You will be given a ship, weapons, and a fair chance. We will send our best warriors against you. If you truly believe that mortality gives you strength, then prove it. His golden eyes gleamed. Win, and we will acknowledge your words. The crowd erupted into murmurs again. A trial of dominion had not been declared in over 1,000 years. It was reserved for disputes that could only be settled through warfare. Elder Vartil stepped forward. You would risk our warriors simply to soothe your wounded pride. Vasher barely glanced at him. I would prove that our rule is not in question. Adrian exhaled slowly. He could feel the trap being laid before him. A duel was one thing, but a full-scale engagement against the most powerful warriors in the galaxy. It was suicide. And yet, a small, knowing smile tugged at his lips. You're hoping I refuse, he said. Vasher's smirk faltered for just a second. Adrian took a step forward. You want me to back down, because if I refuse, you can dismiss everything that happened here. You can say I was just a fluke, a lucky mortal who got a single meaningless victory. His gaze sharpened. That way, your people will forget. The realization spread through the crowd. Vasher's plan wasn't about proving strength. It was about restoring control. But Adrian wasn't about to let that happen. His smile widened. All right then. He extended his hand. I accept. The arena exploded with noise. Some gasped in shock. Others whispered in awe. Elder Vartil's eyes widened. Adrian, this is madness. Vasher's smirk returned, but there was something uneasy behind it now. He hadn't expected Adrian to be this bold. Adrian turned toward the crowd. You want to know what mortality really means? His voice rang through the chamber, filled with certainty. Then send your warriors. His gaze flicked back to Vasher. But know this, you've already lost. Vasher scoffed. Arrogant words for a man walking into his own grave. Adrian's expression remained steady. We'll see. The trial of dominion had been declared. The battle that would shake the foundation of the Vortheri had begun. The countdown had begun. Across the vast expanse of space, the trial of dominion was about to commence. Vortheri warships, massive and elegant, hovered like silent gods of destruction, their golden hulls gleaming under the distant stars. They had never known defeat. And yet, for the first time in their immortal existence, they were about to face one man. Adrian Kale stood on the bridge of the vessel he had been granted, a ship barely worth the name. It was an old war frigate, functional but outdated, its weaponry and shields inferior to anything the Vortheri were fielding. This was never meant to be a fair fight. It was a spectacle. A show of power meant to remind the galaxy that the Vorthari were untouchable, that even a human who had slain one of their own in combat could never hope to match them in war. But Adrian wasn't here for a fair fight. He was here to win. Behind him, the small crew of engineers and tactical officers assigned to his vessel worked in tense silence. They weren't warriors, just neutral observers and technicians meant to ensure the trial was conducted under Vorthari law. None of them expected Adrian to survive. He glanced at the countdown. 5 minutes. A soft beep on the console caught his attention. One of the officers, a young Vorthari named Relin, hesitated before speaking. The first wave is mobilizing. 5 warships. No reinforcements. He frowned. They're testing you. Adrian smiled faintly. Then let's give them something to study. The crew exchanged uncertain glances. Relin cleared his throat. With all due respect, what exactly do you plan to do? Adrian didn't answer. Instead, he reached into a small compartment and pulled out a data chip. He slotted it into the ship's console, and instantly, the outdated systems came to life. Lines of code flooded the screens, rewriting the ship's operating system. The sluggish response time sharpened. The targeting software optimized itself. The engines began humming at a new frequency. Relin's eyes widened. What did you? Adrian leaned back. You think I accepted this fight without a plan? The young officer stared at the screens. The ship's systems, which had been barely functioning minutes ago, now responded like a predator sensing blood. The old rust bucket had been transformed. Relin swallowed. I don't understand. Adrian's smile was cold. That's the difference between you and me. You spent centuries relying on power you never had to earn. He gestured to the screen. Humans, we have to fight for every advantage. The countdown hit 0. The Vorthari fleet opened fire. Adrian moved before the crew could even react. The ship twisted violently to the side, avoiding the first barrage with an unnatural grace. The Vorthari gunners hesitated. Their opponent was not reacting like an outdated relic. Their arrogance had made them sloppy, and Adrian was about to punish them for it. The first enemy warship locked onto his position, its massive plasma cannons charging. Adrian didn't give them the chance. His ship spun in a maneuver that should have torn it apart, but the upgraded systems held. He slipped between the enemy formation, cutting through their ranks like a shadow. He fired, not at their hulls, at their sensor arrays. Explosions erupted across the first warship as its targeting systems failed. The second ship tried to compensate, but Adrian had already vanished into their blind spot. He unleashed another burst of fire, crippling their maneuvering thrusters. 2 warships, disabled in under a minute. The crew on Adrian's ship stared. This isn't possible, one of them whispered. Relin's hands trembled over the controls. This isn't a battle. His voice was barely audible. It's a slaughter. Adrian exhaled. Not yet. The remaining 3 ships adjusted, learning from their mistakes. They moved into a tighter formation, forcing Adrian into a bottleneck. A trap. He smiled. Good. He accelerated straight toward them. The crew braced for impact, but at the last second, Adrian cut the engines. The ship drifted between the warships, momentum carrying it like a silent missile. The Vorthari gunners hesitated. They weren't used to unpredictable movement. Adrian took full advantage. He fired his last torpedoes into the lead ship's fuel reserves. The explosion was instant. The fireball engulfed the entire formation, shockwaves ripping through the remaining ships. 2 of them lost control, their hulls collapsing under the sudden force. The final warship managed to stabilize, but by then, Adrian was already behind them. One final burst of plasma fire tore through their exposed engines. The battle was over. Silence filled the bridge. The Vorthari officers watching the trial from their distant command ship were speechless. This was not how the battle was supposed to go. A single human, in a ship meant to lose, had just wiped out the first wave of their finest warriors. Lord Vasher stood in the War Council chamber, staring at the battlefield in stunned silence. This is impossible," one of his advisors muttered. Vasher's hands trembled with barely contained fury. "No," he whispered. "This is an insult." Adrian's voice cut through the silence. His transmission broadcasted across every Vortheri channel. "Is that it?" The word sent a shockwave through the Empire. Adrian's image appeared on their screens, his face calm, but his eyes burning. "You call this a test? You insult me with this?" He leaned forward. "Send more." The Vortheri, for the first time in their history, were afraid. Because the trial was far from over, and Adrian Kale was just getting started.